At Christmas, my son said those words I never imagined hearing from him. "Don't come. My wife doesn't want you here." The phone nearly slipped from my trembling fingers as the words carved themselves into my chest like broken glass. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. Before we begin, I'd be truly grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video and consider subscribing to the channel. It helps me keep sharing these stories with those who need them most. I stood in my Chicago apartment that December afternoon, the city's winter light filtering through windows I'd cleaned just that morning, hoping everything would be perfect for the holidays. The scent of pine from the small tree in the corner mixed with the cinnamon candles I'd lit, creating an atmosphere of festive warmth that now felt cruelly ironic. My reflection in the hallway mirror showed a woman in her late 60s, wearing the new burgundy sweater I'd bought specifically for Christmas dinner at my son's house, a dinner I was now uninvited to. The sweater suddenly felt too tight, constricting my breathing as I replayed Michael's cold voice in my head. The apartment around me was immaculate. I'd spent the entire week preparing, baking his favorite pecan pie from scratch, wrapping presents with care, selecting just the right card for each family member. The gifts sat in festive bags near the door, mocking me with their cheerful ribbons. Each present had been chosen with such deliberate thought: a cashmere scarf for Jennifer in the deep blue she'd once mentioned liking, educational toys for the grandchildren that I'd researched for hours online, and for Michael, a first-edition book he'd coveted for years that I'd tracked down through 3 different rare book dealers. The expense had stretched my budget uncomfortably thin, but I'd told myself it was worth it to see their faces light up on Christmas morning. A Christmas morning I would now never witness. I could hear the muffled sounds of Chicago traffic below, the distant horn of a taxi, the rumble of the L train a few blocks away. Life continued outside my windows while mine seemed to stop entirely. I walked to the kitchen table and sat down heavily, my hands still shaking. The phone lay face up on the polished wood surface, its screen dark now, but I could still see the call duration: 3 minutes and 42 seconds. That's all it took to shatter what remained of my illusions about my relationship with my only child. I picked up the phone again, scrolling through our message history. The pattern was there, clear as day now that I allowed myself to see it. His texts were always brief, transactional. "Can you transfer $500? Need help with the down payment." Car broke down again, each message a request, never a conversation, never a genuine question about how I was doing. The apartment felt too quiet. I'd lived here for 15 years since Harold passed away, in this cozy 2-bedroom on the north side. The neighborhood had changed over the years, becoming more upscale, but I'd stayed, clinging to familiar streets and the corner deli where they knew my name. The walls held photographs spanning decades: Michael as a baby, his graduation from Northwestern, his wedding 5 years ago to Jennifer. I stood up and walked to the mantel, picking up the wedding photo. Jennifer's smile looked warm in the picture, her arm linked through Michael's, but I remembered that day differently now. The way she'd barely spoken to me during the reception, how she'd changed the seating arrangement at the last minute, placing me at a table with distant relatives instead of with immediate family. I set the frame down and moved to the window, looking out at the December street below. Holiday lights twinkled from neighboring buildings. A family walked past, bundled against the cold, laughing together. The father carried a small child on his shoulders while the mother pushed a stroller. Such a simple scene, yet it felt like looking at something from another world, a world where families actually wanted to be together. My mind drifted back through the years, excavating memories I'd carefully buried. After Harold died, I'd thrown myself into being there for Michael. He was 25 then, just starting his career in finance. I'd cashed out part of Harold's life insurance to help him with his MBA tuition, telling myself it was an investment in his future. Then came the requests for help with his first apartment security deposit, the loan for his car, the down payment assistance for his condo. Each time, I'd said yes without hesitation, pulling from my savings, from the money Harold and I had carefully accumulated over 30 years of marriage. I walked to the spare bedroom, opening the closet where I kept financial documents. The folder was thick with bank statements, transfer confirmations, loan agreements that Michael had promised to repay but never did. I calculated roughly in my head. Over the past decade, I'd given him close to $80,000. Not a fortune by some standards, but it represented years of Harold's hard work, our careful budgeting, our dreams of a comfortable retirement for me, and eventually a substantial inheritance for Michael. Instead, I'd steadily depleted our nest egg while living modestly myself, denying myself small luxuries because I believed I was helping my son build his life. The room grew darker as evening approached. I didn't turn on the lights. There was something fitting about sitting in the growing shadows, finally acknowledging truths I'd avoided for years. Michael's calls had become less frequent after he married Jennifer. The weekly check-ins dwindled to monthly, then to occasional texts. When I'd call him, he'd sound distracted, always with an excuse to cut the conversation short. "I'm in a meeting, Mom. Can I call you back?" He never did. The promises to visit became vague someday plans that never materialized. When was the last time he'd actually come to this apartment? I tried to remember and realized with a jolt that it had been over 2 years. My sister Patricia had tried to warn me. During our last phone call, she'd said gently, "Margaret, you need to open your eyes. He's using you." I'd defended him fiercely, insisting she didn't understand, that he was just busy, that Jennifer was adjusting to having a mother-in-law. But Patricia had only sighed, a sound heavy with the weight of truths I wasn't ready to hear. The Christmas rejection wasn't really sudden, I realized now. It was the culmination of years of increasingly clear signals that I'd chosen to ignore. Last Thanksgiving, I'd been invited but asked to bring all the food and arrive early to help set up, then expected to leave right after dinner to make room for Jennifer's family. The year before, Michael had forgotten my birthday entirely, only remembering 3 weeks later when Patricia mentioned it to him. When I'd been hospitalized with pneumonia last spring, he'd sent a text, "Hope you feel better soon," but never visited, never called, claiming work had him overwhelmed. I stood up from the darkness of the spare room and walked back to the living room, turning on a single lamp. The soft light illuminated my carefully decorated space, the life I'd built alone after Harold's death. I'd done well for myself, all things considered. My pension from 30 years as an elementary school teacher, combined with Harold's Social Security and the remainder of our savings, kept me comfortable. I volunteered at the local library twice a week, had my book club, my Tuesday morning yoga class. I had a life, I realized with some surprise. A life that Michael knew almost nothing about because he never asked. The phone buzzed, making me jump. A text from Michael. "Mom, don't be dramatic about this. It's just one Christmas. We'll see you soon." The casual dismissiveness of it made something crack inside me. Just one Christmas. As if the holiday meant nothing. As if being excluded from my only child's celebration was a minor inconvenience I should gracefully accept. I stared at the message, my finger hovering over the keyboard, 100 responses forming and dissolving in my mind. Instead of replying, I set the phone down and walked to the kitchen. My hands moved automatically through the familiar ritual of making tea, filling the kettle, selecting a cup, the small brown teapot Harold had brought back from a business trip to England decades ago. As I waited for the water to boil, I caught sight of the pecan pie on the counter, perfectly golden, cooling on its rack. I'd made it for people who didn't want me there. The absurdity of it hit me, and I felt something shift inside. A hairline fracture in the foundation of who I thought I was, who I thought I had to be. The kettle whistled, shrill and insistent. I poured the water over the tea leaves, watching the steam rise. But my hands were shaking more than I'd realized, and as I lifted the teapot, it slipped from my grasp. The crash of porcelain against tile seemed impossibly loud in the quiet apartment. shards scattered across the floor, tea spreading in a dark puddle that seeped into the grout lines I'd scrubbed just yesterday. I stood there, frozen, staring at the broken pieces of something Harold had given me. Something I'd treasured and used carefully for 30 years, now destroyed in an instant of lost control. The delicate hand-painted roses on the largest shard seemed to mock me. Something beautiful and carefully preserved, shattered beyond repair. Just like my relationship with my son, I thought bitterly. Just like the future I'd imagined with my family. The brown liquid pooled around my slippers, staining the fabric, but I couldn't bring myself to move or care, and then I was crying. Not the gentle, dignified tears I'd allowed myself at Harold's funeral, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere ancient inside me. I slid down to sit on the kitchen floor, not caring about the mess, the broken porcelain, the spreading tea. I cried for Harold, who'd loved me and valued me and never would have let our son treat me this way. I cried for all the years I'd spent trying to earn Michael's love, as if a mother's love needed to be purchased with money and sacrifice and endless, unquestioning support. I cried for the grandmother I'd imagined being, the family dinners I'd pictured hosting, the relationships I'd thought we were building. When the tears finally subsided, I remained on the floor, exhausted but strangely calm. The apartment was fully dark now, except for that single lamp in the living room. I could see my reflection in the glass of the kitchen cabinets, distorted and wavering. Who was this woman? What had I become? For years I'd defined myself through service to others, as Harold's wife, as Michael's mother, as the helpful teacher, the reliable volunteer, the friend who always showed up when needed. But who was Margaret? What did she want? What did she deserve? I carefully picked up the larger pieces of the broken teapot, wrapping them in newspaper before throwing them away. Some things, once broken, couldn't be repaired. As I mopped up the spilled tea, I felt the symbolism settle over me like a weight. Tomorrow, I decided, things would be different. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew with sudden crystalline clarity that I could not continue on this path. Something had to change. And that something was me. That night, I lay in bed unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling as car headlights occasionally swept across the walls. In the apartment above, I could hear footsteps, muffled voices, the sounds of a family preparing for bed. The normalcy of it felt alien, as if I'd somehow stepped outside the ordinary rhythms of life into some shadowy parallel existence where mothers were disposable, where years of love and sacrifice counted for nothing. I thought about Harold's last words to me, whispered in the hospital room 3 days before he died. "Take care of yourself, Margaret. Promise me." I'd promised, not understanding then what he was really asking. Had he known somehow that Michael wouldn't be there for me? Had he seen something in our son that I'd been too blind to recognize? Harold had always been the one who set boundaries with Michael, who'd insisted he earn his own way, work for his achievements. After Harold died, I'd softened those boundaries, wanting to cushion Michael's grief with generosity, not realizing I was teaching him that my love could be measured in dollars and compliance. The memory of Michael's voice on the phone played on repeat in my mind. "Don't come. My wife doesn't want you here. Not we decided or we're doing something different this year." He'd placed the blame entirely on Jennifer, as if he had no say in the matter, as if his own wishes were irrelevant. But what truly haunted me was his tone. Not apologetic, not regretful, but matter of fact, almost irritated that I might find this hurtful. When had I become such a non-entity in my son's life that excluding me from Christmas required no more consideration than changing a dinner reservation? As dawn began to lighten the sky, I finally fell into a fitful sleep. My dreams a confused tangle of past and present, of Michael as a small boy reaching for my hand, then Michael as he was now, walking away without looking back. The years had been full of warnings I'd chosen not to see. I remembered my 60th birthday party, which I'd planned myself, sending invitations, baking my own cake because I'd wanted to celebrate this milestone with family and friends. Michael had shown up an hour late with Jennifer, stayed for 45 minutes, and spent most of that time on his phone. When they left early, claiming prior commitments, I'd made excuses to my disappointed friends, painting it as a work emergency rather than admitting that my son simply hadn't prioritized my birthday. There was the time I'd been sick with the flu, so ill I could barely get out of bed. I'd called Michael, not asking him to come, but just wanting to hear his voice, some comfort. He'd talked to me for less than 5 minutes before Jennifer's voice in the background interrupted. "We're going to be late," and he'd rushed off the phone with a quick "feel better, Mom." My neighbor Lucy had been the one who'd checked on me, brought soup, picked up my prescriptions. Lucy, who I'd known for only 3 years, had shown more care than my own son. I'd given Michael nearly everything Harold left me, justifying each withdrawal from our carefully built investment portfolio as helping him establish himself. Harold had been smart with money, had invested in stocks over the years, building wealth that was supposed to secure both our retirements and leave something substantial for Michael. But when Michael's hedge fund job had hit a rough patch and he'd needed money to cover his trading losses, I'd liquidated $20,000 in blue-chip stocks. When he'd wanted to invest in cryptocurrency and needed capital, I'd given him $15,000 that he'd promised to return with profits I never saw, money that disappeared into the volatile Bitcoin market without a trace. Each time he'd had compelling reasons, urgent needs, promises of repayment. I'd wanted to believe him, wanted to be the supportive mother who enabled her son's success. Instead, I'd enabled his sense of entitlement, his belief that my resources were his to access at will. The investment accounts Harold had built were now a fraction of their former value. The financial security he'd worked so hard to provide had been systematically dismantled, and I'd participated willingly in my own diminishment. I woke late the next morning, sunlight streaming through the bedroom windows. My first thought was that I'd overslept, that I had things to do, preparations for Christmas to complete. Then reality settled back over me like a heavy blanket. There were no preparations. There was no Christmas dinner to attend. There was nothing I needed to do except figure out how to navigate this new, unwanted reality. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, still in my nightgown at 11 in the morning, something I never allowed myself to do. The apartment felt different in the late morning light, less like a home and more like a stage set for a life I was no longer living. I pulled out my laptop and opened my banking website, something I'd been avoiding for months. The numbers on the screen told a story I already knew, but had refused to fully acknowledge. My savings account, once healthy enough to provide a comfortable cushion, had dwindled to less than $12,000. My investment portfolio, which should have been worth close to $200,000, now held assets valued at just under $65,000. I created a spreadsheet documenting every transfer to Michael over the past 10 years. The total came to $83,400, not including the countless smaller amounts. The dinners I'd paid for, the gifts, the plane tickets I'd bought for visits that never happened. I sat back, staring at the number. That was more than a year of my current income. That was security I'd traded for the illusion of closeness with my son. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to feel angry at Michael. Not just hurt or disappointed, but genuinely, righteously angry. I'd sacrificed my financial security for him, and he'd responded by excluding me from Christmas because his wife found me inconvenient. The injustice of it burned through the fog of denial I'd been living in for years. I printed out the spreadsheet and placed it in a folder, not sure yet what I'd do with it, but needing it to exist in physical form. Something concrete I could point to when doubt crept in and tried to convince me I was being unreasonable. Then I did something I'd never done before. I opened a new document and began writing a letter to Michael. Not a letter I intended to send immediately, but a letter that said everything I'd been too afraid to say, All the hurt and disappointment and anger I'd swallowed down for years in the name of being a good mother, an understanding mother, a mother who didn't make waves or create problems. I wrote about the day he was born, how Harold and I had looked at this tiny person and made promises to always protect him, always love him, always be there for him. I wrote about Harold's death and how I'd tried to be both parents to him afterward, how I'd poured all my love and resources into supporting his dreams. I wrote about every time he'd asked for money and I'd said yes, even when it meant saying no to things I needed. I wrote about the loneliness of holidays spent alone, or with friends who felt sorry for me, about birthdays forgotten, about illnesses endured without his presence or concern. The letter grew to 5 pages, single-spaced, a catalog of hurts both large and small. When I finished, I felt oddly lighter, as if putting these things into words had released some of their power over me. I printed it and placed it in the folder with the financial spreadsheet, a record of everything I'd given and everything I'd lost. That afternoon, I did something completely uncharacteristic. I called my sister Patricia and told her everything: the Christmas exclusion, the years of financial support, my growing realization that I'd allowed myself to become a doormat in my own son's life. Patricia listened without interruption, and when I finished, her response was simple: "It's about damn time you woke up, Maggie." I could hear the relief in her voice, mixed with something else. Perhaps vindication, perhaps sadness that it had taken this long. "We're sisters," she continued, her voice softer now. "I've watched you disappear into this role for years, and it's killed me. Every time I tried to say something, you'd defend him, make excuses. I was starting to think you'd never see it." We talked for 2 hours, and Patricia reminded me of things I'd forgotten or chosen not to see. How at her daughter's wedding 3 years ago, Michael had barely spoken to me, spending the entire reception networking with Jennifer's family connections. How he'd complained to Patricia about me, saying I was too needy, too clingy, that I didn't understand how busy he was. Patricia, to her credit, hadn't told me at the time, not wanting to hurt me. But now she laid it out plainly. "He's been taking advantage of you for years, and you've let him. The question is, what are you going to do about it now?" What was I going to do? That night, I sat in my living room surrounded by the unopened Christmas presents I'd bought for Michael, Jennifer, and their 2 children, grandchildren I barely knew because visits were always too complicated to arrange. I looked at each carefully wrapped package and felt something hard form in my chest. I was done. Done hoping for scraps of attention, done financing a relationship that was entirely one-sided, done being the parent who absorbed all the hurt and disappointment while making excuses for my child's behavior. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Michael's contact information. My finger hovered over the call button, my heart racing. But instead of calling, I opened the text thread and typed a single sentence. "I received your message about Christmas. I understand." I hit send before I could second-guess myself, then turned off my phone and placed it in a drawer. Whatever his response might be, I didn't want to see it tonight. Tonight, I needed to sit with my own decision, my own small act of dignity in the face of rejection. The days between that conversation and Christmas passed in a strange fugue state. I went through my normal routines, library volunteering, yoga class, grocery shopping, but felt fundamentally altered, as if I were watching myself from a distance. Friends asked about my holiday plans, and for the first time, I didn't lie. "I'm staying home this year," I'd say. "My son has other plans." Some friends looked uncomfortable, sensing the pain beneath the neutral words. Lucy, my neighbor, looked at me with understanding eyes and said, "Well, then you'll join me and Frank. We're having a small dinner, nothing fancy, but there's always room for one more." I accepted her invitation with gratitude, struck by the irony that neighbors I'd known for a few years were showing me more consideration than my own flesh and blood. On Christmas Eve, I finally turned my phone back on. There were 3 texts from Michael, each one more annoyed than the last. First, "Okay, fine." Then, 12 hours later, "You're really going to ignore me?" And finally, late on Christmas Eve, "You're being childish about this, Mom. I said we'd see you soon." I read the messages with a strange detachment, as if they'd been sent to someone else entirely. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of how hurtful his initial message had been, no recognition that being uninvited from Christmas might be genuinely painful for a mother. Just annoyance that I wasn't responding with my usual understanding, my usual willingness to smooth things over and pretend nothing was wrong. I didn't respond. Instead, I got dressed in a simple black dress, wrapped myself in the cashmere scarf Patricia had sent for my birthday, and walked the 3 blocks to Lucy and Frank's apartment. Their home was warm and filled with the scent of roasting turkey, pine, and cinnamon. Lucy's adult children were there with their families, and they welcomed me as if I'd always been part of their celebration. We ate and laughed and exchanged small, thoughtful gifts. When they asked about my family, I found myself telling the truth. "My son and I are going through a difficult time." Their response wasn't pity, but acceptance, a quiet acknowledgement that families were complicated and sometimes disappointing. As I walked home that night, full of good food and warmed by genuine kindness, I realized this had been one of the better Christmases I'd had in years. Not because it was elaborate or expensive, but because I'd been with people who actually wanted me there, who valued my presence for its own sake rather than for what I could provide. It was a revelation that felt both freeing and desperately sad. The new year arrived with a foot of snow and sub-zero temperatures that kept most Chicagoans huddled indoors. I used the forced isolation to do something I'd been avoiding for years. I scheduled an appointment with a financial advisor and a therapist. If I was going to rebuild my life, I needed to understand both where I stood financially and why I'd allowed myself to reach this point emotionally. The financial advisor, a kind woman named Sarah who'd been recommended by Patricia, listened to my story without judgment. She reviewed my documents, my spreadsheet of transfers to Michael, my current financial situation. Her assessment was sobering, but not hopeless. "You're not in dire straits, Margaret, but you've significantly reduced your security. If you stop the outflow immediately and make some conservative changes to your investment strategy, you can rebuild a comfortable cushion over the next few years. But you have to stop giving away your resources." She helped me create a new financial plan, one that prioritized my own security and future. We moved the remaining investment funds into more stable vehicles, set up automatic savings transfers, created a strict budget that included money for things I enjoyed: travel, hobbies, small luxuries I'd denied myself for years. For the first time since Harold's death, I had a financial roadmap that centered my own needs rather than my son's wants. The therapist, Dr. Chen, helped me understand the patterns I'd fallen into. We talked about codependency, about how grief had made me cling to Michael as my last connection to the family I'd lost when Harold died. We explored my fear of abandonment, my belief that I had to earn love through service and sacrifice. Slowly, over weeks of sessions, I began to see how I'd participated in creating this dynamic. How my inability to set boundaries had taught Michael that he could treat me as an endless resource without consequence. It was painful work, forcing me to examine not just Michael's failures but my own. I'd been so focused on being the perfect, supportive mother that I'd never required him to be a decent son. I'd accepted crumbs of attention and been grateful, never demanding the respect and reciprocity that should be foundational in any relationship. Dr. Chen helped me understand that setting boundaries wasn't punishment. It was self-preservation, and it was long overdue. In late January, Michael finally called. I let it go to voicemail, needing to prepare myself before engaging. His message was brief and irritated. "Mom, you need to call me back. We need to talk about some things." There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the silent treatment I'd maintained for over a month. Just demands, as always. I called him back the next day, during my lunch break. when I knew I'd have a limited amount of time and a good reason to end the conversation. His voice was cold from the first word. "So you're finally ready to talk to me?" "I'm not calling to fight, Michael. I'm calling because you asked me to." There was a pause, and I could almost hear him recalibrating, shifting strategies. "Look, Mom, Jennifer feels bad about the Christmas thing. We want to invite you to brunch this Sunday." Something about the phrasing caught my attention. Jennifer feels bad. Not "we're sorry" or "I apologize." And the invitation felt less like reconciliation and more like a summons. I surprised myself with my response. "I'm busy this Sunday, maybe in a few weeks." The silence on the other end was palpable. "You're busy?" "Yes, Michael, I have other plans." Another long pause, then his voice took on an edge. "Is this about money? Because if you're upset that I haven't paid back those loans, you know I'm planning to." I cut him off, my voice steady in a way it had never been with him before. "This isn't about money, Michael. This is about respect. I need to go now. I'll talk to you later." I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking but my resolve firm. It was the first time in my life I'd ended a conversation with my son on my own terms, the first time I'd refused to let him control the narrative or deflect from his own behavior. That night, I couldn't sleep, my mind replaying the conversation, analyzing every word, every tone. Part of me wanted to call him back, to apologize for being abrupt, to smooth things over as I always had. But a stronger part of me, a part that was growing more solid with each passing day, held firm. I had nothing to apologize for. I had set a boundary, and if Michael couldn't respect it, that was his problem, not mine. February brought unseasonably warm weather, a false spring that lured Chicagoans out of their winter hibernation. I signed up for a watercolor painting class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but had never made time for. The instructor, a retired art teacher named Ellen, was patient and encouraging. I had no natural talent, but I found the process meditative. The focus required to capture light and shadow on paper, a welcome escape from the constant churning of thoughts about Michael. One afternoon after class, Lucy invited me for coffee at the small cafe on the corner. We'd become closer over the past months, her easy warmth filling some of the void Michael's rejection had created. As we sat with our cappuccinos, Lucy told me about her own family struggles, her estranged brother who'd stolen money from their mother, her daughter who'd chosen her husband's family over her own. "I'm not telling you this to minimize what you're going through," she said gently. "I'm telling you because I want you to know you're not alone, Margaret. Families are messy. Sometimes the people who should love us best are the ones who hurt us most." She reached across the small table and squeezed my hand. Her grip was firm, grounding me in the moment. "You know what I learned?" she continued. "We can't control how others treat us, but we can control how much space we give that treatment in our lives. My brother doesn't get to steal my peace anymore, just like he stole Mom's money. I had to learn that the hard way, at 62 years old. You're learning it now. That takes courage." Her words broke something open in me, and I found myself crying in that busy cafe. Not with the desperate grief of December, but with a cleaner sadness. A mourning for what I'd wanted my relationship with Michael to be, versus what it actually was. Lucy didn't try to fix it or tell me it would get better. She just sat with me, her hand on mine, until the tears subsided and I could breathe normally again. In early March, Michael texted asking to meet for lunch. Part of me wanted to refuse, to maintain the distance I'd been cultivating, but Dr. Chen encouraged me to see it as an opportunity to practice the boundary setting we'd been working on, so I agreed, choosing a restaurant near my apartment, on my turf rather than his. He arrived 15 minutes late, no apology. We ordered, made awkward small talk about weather and his work. Then, over salads neither of us was eating, he said, "So are you going to tell me what this is about?" His tone was defensive, preemptively angry, as if I were the one who'd wronged him. I took a breath, gathering the words I'd practiced with Dr. Chen. This is about me needing to be treated with respect, Michael. This is about setting boundaries around my time, my money, and my emotional energy. He laughed. Actually laughed. A short, dismissive sound. Boundaries? Mom, you're being ridiculous. I'm your son. We're family. Families don't need boundaries. I felt anger rise in my chest but kept my voice level. Actually, Michael, healthy families do need boundaries. And right now, I need you to understand that I'm not going to continue making myself available financially and emotionally when you only reach out when you need something. His face reddened. That's not fair. I'm busy, Mom. I have a demanding job, a wife, kids. I can't be calling you every day. I'm not asking you to call every day. I'm asking you to treat me like someone you value rather than an ATM and an emotional support service you access when convenient. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I don't have to listen to this. I came here to make peace, and you're attacking me. I remained seated, looking up at him. I'm not attacking you, Michael. I'm telling you what I need to continue having a relationship with you. If that feels like an attack, maybe you need to examine why. He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, maybe. That I wasn't backing down, wasn't apologizing, wasn't scrambling to make this okay. Then he turned and walked out, leaving me sitting alone at the table with 2 half-eaten salads and a check he'd made no move to pay. I sat there for several minutes, processing what had just happened. Part of me wanted to run after him, to fix this, to make it right. But I didn't move. Instead, I signaled the waiter, paid the bill, and walked home through the spring sunshine, feeling strangely light despite the heaviness of what had just occurred. I'd stood my ground. I'd said what needed to be said. And if Michael chose to walk away from that, it said everything about who he was and nothing about my worth as a mother. The weeks that followed were difficult. Michael didn't call or text, and I forced myself not to reach out first. Friends asked how he was, and I gave vague answers that didn't invite further questions. Patricia checked in regularly, proud of me for holding my boundaries, but worried about how I was coping. I'm okay, I told her, and was surprised to realize it was mostly true. I missed the idea of Michael, the son I'd imagined I had. But I didn't miss the reality of our relationship, the constant walking on eggshells, the financial drain, the emotional exhaustion of always giving and never receiving. My painting improved marginally. I took longer walks around the neighborhood, noticing details I'd overlooked for years, the architectural features of buildings, the way light filtered through trees, the rhythms of the city I'd lived in for decades but had somehow stopped seeing. I read books I'd been meaning to read, watched movies Harold and I had loved, cooked elaborate meals just for myself, and didn't feel guilty about it. Slowly, I was rebuilding a life that centered my own desires rather than revolving around my son's needs. In mid-April, I received an unexpected email from Michael. The subject line read, "We need to talk about Dad's estate." My heart sank as I opened it. The message was formal, almost legalistic. Mom, I've been reviewing some documents and I believe there are assets from Dad's estate that should have been distributed differently. I'd like to sit down with you and go through everything. Let me know when you're available. I read it 3 times, trying to parse what he was really asking. Harold had left everything to me in his will, a decision we'd made together years before his death. There was no ambiguity, no contested distribution. What Michael was really saying was that he thought he was entitled to more of Harold's estate than he'd received, that he wanted access to what remained of our savings and investments. For the first time since this entire situation had begun, I felt not hurt, but genuine anger. I called Patricia before responding, needing to talk through my reaction before doing something I might regret. Patricia was blunt. He's trying to manipulate you, Maggie. He's realized you're not going to hand over money anymore, so he's trying to find a legal angle. Don't engage with this. If he wants to talk about the estate, Tell him to have his lawyer contact yours. I didn't have a lawyer, but Patricia gave me the name of an estate attorney she'd used when her husband died. I called and made an appointment, bringing all my financial documents, Harold's will, the records of everything I'd given Michael over the years. The attorney, Mr. Morrison, reviewed everything carefully, then looked at me over his reading glasses. Mrs. Winters, I want to be clear. Everything your husband left you is legally yours. Your son has no claim to any of it unless you choose to give it to him. If he's suggesting otherwise, he's either mistaken or attempting to manipulate you. I authorized Mr. Morrison to respond to any legal inquiries Michael might make and left his office feeling protected in a way I hadn't in months. I replied to Michael's email with a single sentence. If you have questions about your father's estate, please have your attorney contact mine. Then I included Mr. Morrison's contact information and hit send. Michael's response came within an hour, and it was everything I'd expected and feared. Are you serious right now? You're actually getting lawyers involved? This is insane, Mom. I just wanted to have a conversation. But I knew better now. This wasn't about conversation. This was about control, about access, about his belief that what was mine was rightfully his. I didn't respond to that email or the 3 increasingly angry ones that followed. Instead, I blocked his email address, a step that felt simultaneously necessary and heartbreaking. I was setting boundaries with my own son in ways that felt like building walls. But I was beginning to understand that sometimes walls were the only way to protect yourself from people who refuse to respect your limits. May arrived with an explosion of spring flowers and the kind of perfect Chicago weather that made you forget the brutal winters. I was in my apartment one afternoon, working on a particularly challenging watercolor of the view from my window, when my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone and approached the door cautiously. Through the peephole, I saw Michael standing in the hallway, and my heart lurched. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. We stood in the doorway, an awkward tableau of family dysfunction. He looked tired, older somehow, though only a few months had passed since our last meeting. Mom, we need to talk. I can't do this anymore. This fighting, this silence. I miss you. His voice cracked on the last words, and for a moment I felt the old pull, the maternal instinct to comfort, to forgive, to make everything okay. But I'd learned something over these months of therapy and self-reflection. I'd learned to distinguish between genuine remorse and manipulation disguised as emotion. I looked at my son and asked a simple question. What do you miss, Michael? Do you miss me, or do you miss what I provided for you? He flinched as if I'd slapped him. That's not fair. I'm your son. I love you. Then show me, I said quietly. Show me through actions, not words. Show me by respecting my boundaries, by contributing to our relationship instead of just taking from it, by treating me like a person you value rather than a resource you access when convenient. We stood there in silence for a long moment. Then Michael did something that surprised me. His shoulders sagged, and he leaned against the doorframe. I don't know how to do this, Mom. I don't know how to be different than I've been. His honesty, raw and unguarded, touched something in me. Then learn, I said gently. Go to therapy. Do the work to understand why you relate to people the way you do. I'll be here when you're ready to build a healthier relationship, but I can't do that work for you. I thought he might argue, might get defensive or angry. Instead, he just nodded, tears sliding down his face. Okay, I'll try. Then he left, and I closed the door, leaning against it as my own tears came. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet. But it was perhaps the first honest exchange we'd had in years, the first moment where the pretenses had dropped and we'd both acknowledged the dysfunction between us. I didn't hear from Michael for several weeks after that encounter, and I resisted the urge to reach out. This had to be his journey, his choice. Either he would do the work or he wouldn't, but I couldn't want it more than he did. In the meantime, I focused on my own continued growth. I signed up for a weekend trip to Galena with my book club, my first solo travel since Harold's death. The trip was restorative, filled with good food, interesting conversations, and the simple pleasure of exploring somewhere new. In early June, I received a letter in the mail from Michael. Not an email or text, but an actual handwritten letter on nice stationery. I sat on my couch with a cup of tea, my hands trembling slightly as I opened it. The letter was 3 pages long, and from the first line I could tell it was different from any communication we'd had before. "Dear Mom," it began. "I've started seeing a therapist. You were right. I needed to do this work. I'm beginning to understand how much I've hurt you, how I've taken you for granted and treated you as a source of support without giving anything back. I'm sorry, not because I want something from you, but because you deserved better than what I gave you." He wrote about his own struggles, his fear of failure, his need to appear successful even when he was drowning financially and emotionally. He acknowledged the money I'd given him over the years and proposed a repayment plan, modest but consistent. He didn't ask for forgiveness or promise immediate change, but he committed to trying to be different, to building a relationship based on mutual respect rather than one-sided dependency. I read the letter 3 times, each time finding new layers of honesty and self-awareness. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't erase years of hurt, but it was a beginning. I wrote back, a shorter letter that thanked him for his honesty, and told him I was proud he was doing the work. I didn't make promises about what our relationship would look like going forward, but I left the door open to possibility. Over the summer, Michael and I began rebuilding slowly. We met for coffee once a month, brief meetings with clear boundaries. He didn't ask for money, and I didn't offer it. We talked about his therapy, about the patterns he was recognizing and working to change. We talked about my own therapy journey, about the ways I'd enabled his behavior and was learning to set healthier limits. It was awkward and sometimes painful, but it was real in a way our relationship had never been before. In August, something happened that tested everything we'd been working toward. Jennifer filed for divorce. Michael called me, his voice broken, asking if he could come over. Not for money, not for me to fix it, just to sit with someone who loved him while his world fell apart. I said yes, and when he arrived, we sat on my couch for hours while he cried and talked and tried to make sense of what had happened. I watched my son crumble before me, his carefully constructed life dissolving like sugar in water, and felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction or vindication, but genuine compassion mixed with sadness. This was still my child, still the boy I'd rocked to sleep and comforted through nightmares. The difference was that now I could hold space for his pain without absorbing it as my own, without making it my responsibility to fix. He told me things I'd never known, how Jennifer had controlled their finances, how she'd kept him from having a relationship with me because she saw me as competition, how he'd felt trapped between loyalty to his wife and his need for his mother, but had made the wrong choice over and over. I listened without trying to fix or advise, just present with him in his pain. At one point, he looked at me with red-rimmed eyes and said, "I'm so sorry, Mom, for all of it, for choosing her over you, for using you, for being such a terrible son." "I'm not going to lie and say everything is perfect now," I told him. "What happened between us caused real damage, and it's going to take time to heal. But I appreciate you being here, being honest, doing the work. That matters." We sat together until late into the night, and when he left, I felt cautiously hopeful in a way I hadn't in years. The divorce proceedings were messy and painful. Michael discovered that Jennifer had been hiding money, that she'd been having an affair for over a year, that she'd manipulated situations to isolate him from friends and family who might have provided support or perspective. In a strange way, his pain opened him up to understanding how he'd hurt me, how his treatment of me mirrored some of what Jennifer had done to him. As fall arrived, bringing crisp air and brilliant foliage, Michael and I found ourselves in a different place than we'd been a year ago. We had dinner together once a week, taking turns cooking. He'd bring his kids, my grandchildren, and I was building relationships with them that felt genuine and warm. He'd started making payments on the money he'd borrowed, modest amounts that were more symbolic than substantial. But the gesture mattered. He was showing through actions that he valued me, that our relationship meant something beyond what I could provide. In October, something happened that brought everything into sharp focus. I received a phone call from Mr. Morrison, my attorney. "Mrs. Winters, I wanted to let you know that we've discovered some irregularities regarding your late husband's estate. It appears there was an additional investment account that wasn't included in the original probate. The account, invested heavily in technology stocks and some cryptocurrency holdings from the early days of Bitcoin, had grown substantially. Harold had set it up years ago and apparently forgotten about it, or perhaps meant it as a surprise. The value was significant, close to $400,000. I had to sit down as Mr. Morrison continued explaining the details, my mind reeling. Harold, I thought, tears streaming down my face. Even in death, you're still taking care of me. I could almost hear his voice, that gentle insistence from his hospital bed. Promise me you'll take care of yourself, Margaret. This was his final insurance policy, his last act of protection, ensuring I would never be left vulnerable. The timing felt almost miraculous, as if Harold had been watching over me, waiting until I'd found my strength before revealing this final gift. I sat down heavily, stunned by this unexpected windfall. My first instinct was to call Michael, to share this news, to celebrate Harold's foresight together. But I paused, recognizing the old pattern trying to reassert itself. This money was mine, Harold's final gift to me, ensuring my security and comfort. What I chose to do with it was my decision, made from a place of strength rather than fear or guilt. I scheduled a meeting with Sarah, my financial advisor, and we created a plan. The money would be invested conservatively, ensuring my financial security for the rest of my life. I'd use some of it for things I'd always wanted. Travel, maybe a small place up in Door County for summers, donations to causes I cared about. And yes, I'd set aside a modest trust for my grandchildren's education. Not because I owed it to Michael, but because I wanted to invest in their futures. But the bulk of it would remain mine, a cushion that meant I'd never again have to choose between my own security and helping my child. When I finally told Michael about the discovered account, his reaction told me everything I needed to know about how far we'd both come. Instead of asking what this meant for him, he said, "Mom, that's incredible. Dad must be smiling right now, knowing you're going to be taken care of." Then he hugged me, a gesture of pure affection without agenda, and I felt tears prick my eyes at the simple beauty of it. In November, I did something I'd been planning for months. I booked a 2-week trip to Italy for the following spring, a dream Harold and I had shared but never fulfilled. When I told Michael, he was genuinely excited for me. "That's amazing, Mom. You deserve this. Have you thought about what cities you want to visit?" We spent an hour looking at maps and travel guides together, him sharing tips from a business trip he'd taken to Rome years ago, me showing him the small towns Harold and I had researched together. As Thanksgiving approached, Michael asked if I'd like to host dinner at my apartment. Not because he needed me to do the cooking or provide the space, but because he wanted to give me the honor of gathering the family together. "I'd do all the cooking," he offered. "You just enjoy being the grandmother." I accepted, touched by the gesture and the thought behind it. Thanksgiving Day arrived cold and clear. Michael showed up early with his kids and bags of groceries. We cooked together in my small kitchen, him following recipes I'd used for decades, the children setting the table with my good china. When we sat down to eat, Michael asked if he could say something before the blessing. He looked around the table at his children, then at me. "I want to thank Mom for everything she's given us over the years, but especially for the gift she gave me this past year. The gift of expecting more from me, of refusing to accept less than I was capable of being. You taught me that real love sometimes means saying no, setting boundaries, and requiring people to grow. I'm grateful for that lesson, even though it was hard to learn. I felt tears slide down my cheeks as his words settled over me. We held hands around the table, and as I looked at the faces of my family, my son who'd hurt me but was learning to do better, my grandchildren who were getting to know me as a person rather than just a source of gifts and money, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the false peace of denial or enabling, but the real peace that comes from authentic relationship, from knowing you're valued for who you are rather than what you provide. That evening, after Michael and the kids left, after the dishes were done and the leftovers put away, I sat on my couch with a glass of wine and looked around my apartment. The space looked different than it had a year ago. There were new paintings on the walls, my own watercolors, imperfect but full of life. There were photographs from my Galena trip, from outings with Lucy and Frank, from recent dinners with Michael and the kids where everyone was genuinely smiling. The apartment felt lived in, loved, a reflection of a life that was full and meaningful rather than empty and waiting. I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, sitting in this same spot on Christmas Eve, devastated by my son's rejection, believing that my worth was measured by my usefulness to others. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone I'd once been but had grown beyond. The journey from there to here had been painful, requiring me to face hard truths about both Michael and myself, but the pain had been worth it because it had led to something real. I picked up my phone and opened the Notes app, writing something I wanted to remember. Today, I learned that the opposite of love isn't hate. It's self-abandonment. For years, I thought loving Michael meant sacrificing myself, my security, my dignity. But real love requires wholeness, not martyrdom. Real love means valuing yourself enough to require others to value you too. Real love says, I care about you, but I also care about me, and both of those things matter. As Christmas approached again, a full year since Michael's devastating phone call, I found myself in a completely different place emotionally. This year, there was no question about whether I'd be included in celebrations. Michael had asked me weeks ago what I wanted to do for Christmas, genuinely caring about my preferences rather than making unilateral decisions. We'd settled on Christmas Eve at my place, Christmas Day with his kids, a rhythm that felt balanced and respectful of everyone's needs. On Christmas Eve, as I set out cookies I'd baked with my grandchildren earlier that week, I heard the buzzer. Michael stood in the hallway with his arms full of wrapped presents and a bottle of champagne. Before I could say anything, he set everything down and pulled me into a hug. Thank you, Mom, for not giving up on me, even when I gave you every reason to. I hugged him back, feeling the weight of the past year settle into something lighter, something that felt like hope. As we celebrated together that evening, laughing and talking and building new memories, I realized this was the real gift, not the reconciliation itself, but the knowledge that I'd found my worth independent of anyone else's recognition of it. Michael's transformation was meaningful and beautiful, but even if it hadn't happened, even if he'd chosen to stay stuck in his old patterns, I would have been okay. I'd built a life that didn't require his validation, friendships that sustained me, interests that fulfilled me, a sense of self that was solid and sure. Later that night, after Michael left, I sat by my small Christmas tree with its twinkling lights, thinking about the journey of this past year. I'd lost so much, illusions about my relationship with my son, a significant portion of my financial security, the comfortable fiction that I was a good mother simply because I gave endlessly without requiring anything in return. But I'd gained something more valuable than what I'd lost. I'd gained myself back. I thought about all the other mothers and fathers out there, people in their 60s and 70s and 80s, who were living versions of what I'd experienced. People who'd given everything to their children and received little in return, who felt used and dismissed and taken for granted, who were afraid to set boundaries because they feared losing the only family connections they had. I wished I could tell each of them what I'd learned. You are valuable regardless of what you can provide. You deserve respect, reciprocity, genuine affection. Setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's the foundation of healthy relationship. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their worst behaviors and require them to grow. As the year drew to a close, I found myself making plans that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs or expectations. I booked my Italy trip for April, started researching volunteer opportunities working with literacy programs, signed up for an advanced painting class. I was building a life that was fully mine, a life that would sustain me regardless of what happened in my relationships with others. On New Year's Eve, Lucy and Frank invited me to a small party at their apartment. As midnight approached, we gathered on their balcony to watch fireworks over the city. Lucy raised her glass in a toast. "To new beginnings," she said, looking directly at me. "To finding the courage to value ourselves." We clinked glasses, and as the first fireworks burst over Chicago's skyline, I felt something shift inside me, a final release of the old patterns and beliefs that had kept me small. The next morning, New Year's Day, Michael called. "Mom, I've been thinking. I want to start a new tradition with you. Once a month, just you and me, we go to lunch. No kids, no distractions. I want to really know you, not just as my mother, but as a person. Tell me about your life, your interests, your dreams. I want to understand who Margaret Winters is beyond the role you've played in my life." I agreed, touched by his proposal and the intentionality behind it. Our first lunch was that following week, and for the first time in our adult relationship, Michael asked me questions about my life and really listened to the answers. He wanted to know about my watercolor class, my book club, my thoughts on the books I was reading. He asked about my memories of Harold, not the sanitized version I usually shared, but the real, complicated relationship we'd had. He asked what I was learning in therapy, what dreams I had for my future. I found myself opening up in ways I never had with him before, sharing the person I was rather than just the role I filled. It felt vulnerable and risky, but also freeing. And Michael met that vulnerability with his own, talking about his therapy journey, the patterns he was working to change, his fears about being a good father to his own children. For the first time, we were relating as two adults, two flawed humans trying to do better, rather than as mother and son locked in a dysfunctional dynamic. As winter progressed into early spring, I noticed small but significant changes in how I moved through the world. I walked with my head up, made decisions without second-guessing myself, spoke my truth even when it was uncomfortable. The woman who'd sat devastated on Christmas Eve a year ago, who'd measured her worth by her son's approval, who'd given away her security in hopes of purchasing love, that woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger and wiser and more whole. In March, 2 months before my Italy trip, something happened that brought the transformation full circle. I was at the grocery store when I ran into Jennifer, Michael's ex-wife. We'd barely spoken since the divorce, and I felt my body tense as she approached. "Margaret, can we talk for a minute?" she asked, her voice uncertain. We stepped to the side of the aisle, and she took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology. I spent years keeping Michael from you because I was threatened by your relationship. I told myself it was about protecting our family, but really it was about my own insecurities. I'm sorry for the role I played in hurting you." Her eyes were red-rimmed and I could see she'd been crying recently. The woman before me looked diminished somehow, stripped of the polished confidence she'd always projected. "My therapist helped me see," she continued, her voice breaking slightly, "that I was repeating patterns from my own mother. She kept me from my grandmother out of jealousy, and I did the same thing to our kids with you. I robbed them of knowing you, and I robbed you of being part of their lives. I can't undo that, but I wanted you to know I see it now. I'm sorry." Her apology caught me completely off guard. It would have been easy to hold on to anger, to reject her words, to make her feel the pain she'd contributed to. But I'd learned something over this past year, about the weight of carrying resentment. I appreciate you saying that, I told her. What happened was painful, but I'm in a different place now. I hope you're finding your own path forward. We parted cordially, and as I walked to my car, I felt lighter, as if her apology had released something I didn't even know I was carrying. April arrived with the promise of my long-awaited trip to Italy. The night before I left, Michael came over to help me finish packing. As we checked items off my list, he suddenly stopped and looked at me. Mom, I'm proud of you. Not just for taking this trip, but for everything you've done this past year. You could have stayed stuck in bitterness, but instead, you chose growth. You taught me what resilience actually looks like. His words settled over me like a benediction, validating the hard journey I'd walked. Italy was everything I'd dreamed and more. I wandered through Rome's ancient streets, stood in awe before Florence's art, drank wine in Tuscany's rolling hills. But the best moments weren't the famous sights. They were the small discoveries, the conversations with strangers, the feeling of being completely myself in a place where no one knew me as anyone's mother or wife. I was just Margaret, a woman exploring the world, and it felt glorious. In a small trattoria in Siena, I struck up a conversation with an elderly Italian woman who reminded me of my own grandmother. She told me, in broken English mixed with expressive gestures, that she'd lost her husband 20 years ago and had been traveling ever since. You are never too old to begin again, she said, raising her wine glass to me. My troppo vecchia. Never too old. I clinked my glass against hers, feeling the truth of her words settle into my bones. This trip wasn't just about seeing Italy. It was about seeing myself, whole and complete, independent of any role or relationship. I sent Michael postcards from each city, not because he expected it, but because I wanted to share these moments with him. His responses came in texts that showed genuine interest and excitement for my adventures. When I returned home, tanned and happy and full of stories, he picked me up from the airport and actually asked to see all my photos, listening patiently as I narrated each one. The months that followed settled into a new normal. Michael and I had our monthly lunches, sometimes bringing the kids, sometimes just the two of us. He continued making payments on the money he'd borrowed, and while it would take years to repay it all, the consistency mattered more than the amount. Our relationship wasn't perfect. We still had moments of misunderstanding, times when old patterns tried to reassert themselves, but we'd built a foundation of honesty and respect that allowed us to navigate those moments without destroying what we'd created. I continued my watercolor classes, my volunteer work, my friendships with Lucy and Frank and the book club ladies. I planned another trip for the following year, this time to Ireland. I invested in my grandchildren's lives not through money but through time and presence, showing up for their school events, teaching them to bake, taking them to museums and parks. I was building memories with them that would last long after I was gone, giving them the gift of knowing their grandmother as a full person rather than just a source of gifts. On the anniversary of that devastating Christmas phone call, I took myself out to dinner at a nice restaurant, a private celebration of how far I'd come. As I sat alone at a table by the window, watching Chicago's evening lights, I reflected on the journey. A year ago, I'd been broken, feeling worthless and used and abandoned. Today, I was whole, knowing my value independent of anyone else's recognition of it. The transformation hadn't been easy or painless, but it had been necessary. I thought about all the moments that had led me here, the broken teapot, the letters I'd written but never sent, the first time I said no, the therapy sessions where I'd cried and raged and slowly found my strength. Each moment had been a small death and rebirth, letting go of who I'd been to become who I needed to be. And while the catalyst had been Michael's rejection, the journey had ultimately been about me, my choices, my growth, my decision to value myself even when others didn't. As I finished my meal and prepared to leave, the waiter brought over a small dessert I hadn't ordered. "From the gentleman at the bar," he said, gesturing across the room. I looked over to see an older man raising his glass to me with a kind smile. I smiled back, acknowledging the gesture but not encouraging more. It was a small moment, but it reminded me that life held possibilities I hadn't considered, doors I hadn't opened because I'd been too focused on the one relationship that was failing. I walked home that night through familiar streets, past the deli where they knew my order, the park where I sometimes sat with my watercolors, the corner where Lucy and Frank lived. This was my neighborhood, my city, my life, and it was enough. More than enough. It was full and rich and entirely mine. The next morning, I woke early and did something I'd been planning for weeks. I took out the folder containing all the financial records of what I'd given Michael over the years, the spreadsheet I'd created in those dark December days. I read through it one last time, acknowledging the pain and the lessons it represented. Then I fed it into my shredder, watching the numbers and dates dissolve into confetti. The past was the past. I didn't need to carry it anymore. Later that day, Michael called with news that made me laugh with surprised joy. "Mom, I got a promotion, and the first thing I wanted to do was tell you. Not ask you to celebrate in some specific way, not ask you to do anything. Just share this good news with you because you matter to me." We talked for 20 minutes about his new role, his excitement, his concerns. It was an ordinary conversation between a mother and son who genuinely cared about each other's lives, and its very ordinariness was extraordinary given where we'd been. As spring turned to summer and then to fall again, I found myself thinking less about the pain of the past and more about the possibilities of the future. I'd learned something crucial. Transformation isn't a destination but a continuous process. There would be setbacks and challenges, moments when old fears tried to pull me back into old patterns. But I'd built something stronger than those fears, a sense of self that wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval or affection. I started writing these experiences down, not for publication, but as a legacy for my grandchildren. I wanted them to know that their grandmother had been more than just the sweet old lady who baked cookies and gave gifts. I wanted them to understand that I'd struggled and failed, and found my way to wholeness, that I'd made mistakes as a mother and then done the hard work of growing beyond those mistakes. I wanted them to know that it's never too late to change, never too late to require better from yourself and others. In November, as another Thanksgiving approached, I hosted again. But this year felt different because I knew it wasn't obligatory or transactional. Michael and the kids came because they wanted to be there, because our relationships had deepened beyond duty into genuine affection. As we gathered around the table, I looked at each face and felt overwhelming gratitude, not for the specific people or relationships, but for the journey that had brought me to this place of peace and self-knowledge. That evening, after everyone left, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching snow begin to fall over Chicago. The city lights reflected off the fresh white coating, creating a magical landscape. I thought about the question I wanted to leave with anyone who might hear this story. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family, valued only for what you provide rather than who you are? Have you ever given so much of yourself that you lost sight of your own worth? If this story sounds familiar, if you've lived something similar or know someone who has, I want you to understand something crucial. Your worth isn't determined by how useful you are to others. Your value doesn't diminish when you set boundaries or say no. The people who truly love you will respect your limits, and those who don't, well, their opinion shouldn't define your reality. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you experienced something like this? How did you navigate it? What did you learn? Please share your story. Your truth might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find their own strength. And if this message resonated with you, if it spoke to something you've been feeling but couldn't quite articulate, I'd appreciate it if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. Not for me, but because the more people who hear these stories, the more mothers and fathers and grandparents will understand that they're not alone, that their feelings are valid, that they deserve better than they've been accepting. As I sat there that November evening, watching snow transform my city into something clean and new, I understood that my story wasn't unique. Somewhere out there, another mother was sitting with a phone in her hand, devastated by her child's rejection. Another father was questioning whether he'd failed somehow, whether his worth was really measured in dollars and compliance. Another grandparent was feeling invisible, taken for granted, used up. To each of them, I wanted to say, "You are not alone. Your pain is real and valid, and there is a path forward. Though it requires courage you might not know you have. The journey from brokenness to wholeness is hard, but it's worth every difficult step. On the other side of that pain is something precious, yourself, whole and valued and free." The story of that devastating Christmas phone call had brought me here, to this moment of peace and self-knowledge. And while I wouldn't wish that pain on anyone, I also wouldn't trade the transformation it catalyzed. I'd found myself in the breaking, discovered my strength in the rebuilding. And now, watching snow fall over my beloved city, I understood that this was the real gift. Not the reconciliation with Michael, though I was grateful for it, but the reconciliation with myself. I was Margaret Winters, 68 years old, a mother and grandmother, a watercolor painter and book club member, a woman who'd traveled to Italy alone and planned to see Ireland next year. I was someone who'd been broken and had chosen to heal, who'd been used and had learned to set boundaries, who'd been dismissed and had claimed her own value. I was all of these things, and I was enough. More than enough. I was whole. And that wholeness, I realized, was what I wanted to leave as my legacy. Not money or possessions, but the understanding that we teach people how to treat us, that love requires respect, and that it's never too late to choose yourself. These lessons, hard-won and precious, were the real inheritance I could offer my family and anyone else who might need to hear them. As the evening deepened and the snow continued to fall, I raised my wine glass to my reflection in the window, to the woman I'd become, to the journey that had brought me here. "To new beginnings," I whispered, echoing Lucy's New Year's toast. To the courage to value ourselves, to choosing wholeness over comfort, to life beyond the roles we play, to finding ourselves in the breaking and the rebuilding. To Margaret Winters, who finally understood that her worth had never been up for debate,